Good afternoon. As the designated federal officer and acting chair of the Agricultural Advisory Committee, it's my pleasure to call this meeting to order. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's virtual meeting. While this is certainly not how we envisioned the first AAC meeting under Chairman Tarbert's sponsorship, we are grateful for the chance to come together in a way that keeps us all safe and healthy. Before we get started, there are a few logistical items that I do need to mention to the committee members and invited speakers. Because this is a virtual meeting, it's also being broadcast, so please make sure you identify yourself before you begin speaking. Also, please signal when you have completed your comments so we can continue with the next speaker or question. Ensure your phone is unmuted before you start to speak and that you speak clearly into the mic. For committee members, please send a message to the panelist group on WebEx or dial *0 if you would like to be recognized during the discussion. Finally, please keep your telephone line muted when you are not speaking. If you do not mute your line, the conference operator may need to mute your line for you. Now that I have those housekeeping items out of the way, I'd like to turn this over to the committee sponsor, Chairman Heath Tarbert, for his opening remarks and introduction of our honored guest. Chairman Tarbert.
Thank you very much, Summer. This is Chairman Heath Tarbert. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's meeting of the Agricultural Advisory Committee. First, I want to say that I'm humbled to be a sponsor of this committee. The members of this committee and the industry groups you're a part of have mobilized and risen to the challenge of feeding our nation during this pandemic. I realize a lot of you and your members are struggling, and I therefore specifically want to thank you on behalf of the agency for the important work you're doing. It's truly an honor to work with you. Agriculture is essential to the basic needs of everyone around the world. We're reminded of that now more than ever. The ag sector also plays a critical role in our economy and has been the cornerstone of the Commodity Exchange Act since it was actually ag-related products that gave birth to the global derivatives markets. So as I've said before, and I'll say again, if the derivatives markets aren't working for American agriculture, then in my view, they're simply not working. Today we face unprecedented uncertainty and price volatility across our ag commodity markets. Many of you rely on these markets to mitigate and hedge risk as agricultural producers and end users. Given the unique circumstances we're facing due to COVID-19, it's important that we have this call to discuss what we're seeing, how we're managing it, and what tools we have in place to address the uncertainty and volatility ahead. Our job at the CFTC is to understand the challenges confronting the agricultural sector and to ensure that our derivatives markets are doing the job of providing opportunities for end users to manage risk. To start us off, I'd like to share a couple of updates about our work here at the CFTC. Last week, in response to the growing public concern around the livestock markets, I established a livestock markets task force that will monitor daily, in real time, livestock contracts. So we're talking about the live cattle, the feeder cattle, and the lean hogs contracts specifically. I'm pleased to report that this task force is up and running to ensure market integrity in these uncertain times. I'm also excited to announce that we will soon appoint a CFTC liaison to the U.S. Department of Agriculture for the first time in our 45 years as an agency. As many of you know, the predecessor to our agency, the Commodity Exchange Commission, was actually part of the Department of Agriculture. And then it was spun off and made into an independent agency. But in so doing, the original Commodity Exchange Act that gave rise to as amended, gave rise to the CFTC, actually requires that the USDA appoint a liaison officer for the purposes of maintaining a relationship between the USDA and the CFTC, now that the CFTC became an independent agency. So to facilitate that cooperation, the CFTC will assign a member of our Division of Market Oversight staff to be a primary point of contact for the USDA liaison. So in other words, We're also going to have a CFTC liaison to USDA, just as we have a USDA liaison to the CFTC. And that's really important, again, to signify that we have a robust dialogue and continued historical coordination with USDA on matters of mutual interest. The final point I want to make is that the CFTC team is teleworking just like the rest of America and much of the world. But even though we're physically separated, our commitment to our critical mission is stronger than ever. We won't let these challenges stop us from doing the necessary work to fulfill our mission, which is to promote the integrity, resilience, and vibrancy of the U.S. derivatives markets through sound regulation. I'd like to thank staff from the CME Group and ICE Futures US for joining the call today. I also want to thank my fellow commissioners, Commissioner Quintens, Commissioner Benham, Commissioner Stump, and Commissioner Berkovitz for joining, and I'm looking forward to their statements. We're also fortunate to have Rob Johansson, the Chief Economist for USDA, on the line, as well as a number of leaders and experts from our own division of market oversight. But I want to give special thanks and a grand welcome to Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, who's on the call with us today. The Department of Agriculture and Secretary Perdue are on the front lines of this fight. Given the extraordinary times we're facing, I can't think of anyone more qualified or more equipped to lead the department. I think we can all agree that we're lucky to have Secretary Perdue at the helm of USDA. Secretary Perdue and I have stayed in touch since the very start of the pandemic. Staff of the USDA and the CFTC have been communicating regularly on market conditions and factors that impact pricing in our ag markets. Our partnership with the Department of Agriculture is critical to our work here at the CFTC, and we're grateful for the Secretary and the Department, the insight and knowledge they bring to our discussions. Secretary Perdue, thank you so much for joining us today, taking time out of your tremendously busy schedule to share some remarks with the Agriculture Advisory Committee. Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Tarbert, and for all your commissioners and your members of the Ag Advisory Committee. Good afternoon, and it is an honor to join you. And I want to be one of the first to welcome your CFTC back to its roots at USDA, and we appreciate very much the liaison. Obviously, our fortunes are intertwined, and our responsibilities and roles are intertwined more and more, so it seems like. And I appreciate the efforts that you've made in the relationship that we enjoy. Thank you for your leadership and engagement on agricultural issues. I'm well aware that other sectors in the economy may have outpaced the futures trading, but I very much appreciate you all recognizing the bedrock issue of agriculture in futures trading as well. And it's certainly its price discovery and transparency is critical in our sector. And I appreciate very much what CFTC does in that effort. So I'm really also want to congratulate you for reviving this Ag Advisory Committee and meeting on a regular basis after being inactive for a while. And I really appreciate your prioritizing hearing from your users in the various sectors, farmers, ranchers, under your leadership. And I know just a couple of months ago that we were in our office here discussing the state of the farm economy, but after all that's going on, it seems like a lot longer than that. But you know that our whole economy has been hurt hard, and agriculture is no exception. But just as we all are discovering more and more, I think we've come to a better appreciation of our farming and food production and food supply chain is much more appreciated because of its essentiality than it had been before. So I do want to tell you in the beginning, and all your members on the committee, that I'm very proud of your individual sectors. I'm proud of all of our farmers and ranchers, as well as everyone involved, from the vendors helping our farmers to all the way to the consumer and the food supply chain, getting it done day in and out. This has been an amazing, resilient effort. I know that we realize that it's been our food supply chain is one of the most efficient. It's sophisticated. It's integrated. It's almost synchronized in many ways and just in time. So the COVID-19 impacts have rippled through that. When you think about the dual supply chain that we really have developed in this country because of efficiency. When you think of half of the food being consumed outside of the home, they developed a supply chain that served that restaurant and institutional market very efficiently in different types of packaging and quantities and products even in that way. When you have that whole sector, half of that consumption stopped, you can imagine the ripple effect. It's like a crash on interstate highways where everything gets backed up. But we've been very active in trying to reallocate and realign the supply and demand with that, with the needed demand here across the country. So you know well that price movements over the last few years have been primarily driven by those significant demand shifts or market expectations for changes in demand in the near future. And just example, we got cotton prices at decade lows in that. Livestock prices are at multi-year lows due to the loss of that institutional and restaurant market. And there have been also concerns about potential closures or disruptions in the processing industry as well. So all of those are vital and critical, and we appreciate your attention to recognizing the need for transparent integrity, markets of integrity that people can depend on and really make their future business, either production or consumption decisions around. And it's critical that we maintain our commodity future trading in this country as the gold star around the world in a 24-hour global environment that we're in right now. So USDA obviously is working as quickly as possible to bring help to those producers who have been devastated. You may recall that last week the President announced a $19 billion support for those producers, through direct payments as well as our out-of-the-box food distribution system program that we're developing. So we'll use the funding from resources as well as CCC funds to do that. Congress really essentially also gave about $25 billion more in food stamp recipients, increased funding for our food nutrition services for our school children as well as those people in need from out of jobs and things like that. So we're going to continue to provide direct support based to the producers where prices and market supply chains have been significantly impacted. And as you know, in the government, we've got a lot of steps that we have to do to implement programs. We have to write rules. We have to be detailed, make sure they're transparent, fairly implemented, and by rule and not just by feel. So we're doing that as we speak. I'm hoping that our purchase and distribution of both produce, dairy, and meat products will be able to begin within 2 weeks, and then the direct support will require rulemaking, but we hope to have sign-ups beginning in late May as quickly as we're able to. So more information, more details are going to be provided when that rule is published. But we're working daily and sometimes 24 hours a day with our federal partners, FEMA, HHS, CDC, and additional support and guidance regarding food supply chain, continuity of operations, reopening processes, and processors of both food and agricultural sector. And we're working with CDC and OSHA to provide guidance on our best practices for our employees in our meat, poultry, seafood processing facilities. And it's been an interesting time. It's one challenge after the other, but I'm very proud of the team at USDA. I think the public would be extremely proud if they saw these people working remotely, actually in a more difficult environment, getting the job done. So we're monitoring, certainly, as you indicated, the flow of food from farm to table and paying particular attention to any supply-demand disruptions or divergences that seem to be not reasonable. You may remember, or your members may know, that on April 8, 2020, I directed our agricultural marketing service to extend its investigation initiative after the Holcomb fire in Kansas, and to include the price effects for live cattle and box beef during the current COVID emergency. So as part of this ongoing investigation, our Packers and Stockyards Division will determine if there's any evidence of price manipulation, collusion, restrictions of competition, or any unfair practices or unfair advantages. And that's what our public expects, that's what our producers expect, and I hope that's what all the people in between expect as well. And I know that's the reason you're set up your task force, and we look forward to working directly with that task force as well as your liaison. So you can rest assured if any of that investigation yields any evidence of any violation of the Packers and Stockyards Act, we'll begin immediate necessary enforcement action, and where appropriate, initial referrals to the Department of Justice for further consultation. So I know trade is a huge part. That's why the markets are here in the United States, and we're working hard even through these difficult times to help find customers overseas and reduce the barriers to doing business with them. We've got USDA, the Phase 1 Japan agreement, beginning implementation of China Phase 1, and a number of priorities, including the EU and UK, that I wanted to mention as well. But those are some highlights. I know I've spoken longer rather than I intended, but I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to your members. It's a good, distinguished group that you have there that I know they will give you good counsel regarding the agricultural aspects of the commodity future trading, and I very much appreciate as I said, the relationship, and look forward to continuing. Dr. Johansson, who's the real brains behind USDA, as our economist, will be here to help answer any specific questions about our CFAP program or anything else that your members may have as we go along. So thank you very much for the opportunity, Chairman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, and I'm sure I speak for everyone on the call to say it's tremendously valuable to hear directly from you on these important issues, and we are all very grateful for your leadership, and I look forward to strengthening the relationship between the department and our agency in the weeks, days, and months and years ahead. So thank you so much.
You're here. Thank you.
This is Summer Mercinger again. Now I'd like to turn to the commissioners for their opening remarks. First, I'll check in with Commissioner Quintens. Commissioner Quintens, are you on the line?
Yeah, Summer, this is Commissioner Quintens. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Thank you. This is Commissioner Brian Quintens, and first let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership in convening today's meeting, and what a privilege not only to have Secretary Perdue join us today, but to have him in that role and at this time. I'm so grateful to have heard from him about USDA's ongoing efforts in this unprecedented time for the agricultural community. And given that ongoing historic levels of prices and volatility in the agricultural cash and futures markets, it's timely that this committee specifically could come together today to share their insights with us on liquidity and market integrity and accessibility of futures markets with the Commission. America's agricultural producers and growers tirelessly dedicate themselves to putting food on our kitchen tables while they themselves constantly struggle to ensure the solvency of their farms and their ranches. The CFTC, along with the futures exchanges and market intermediaries, must work just as tirelessly to ensure that our futures markets remain a reliable, efficient hedging tool for them. This agency has a unique role to play in protecting America's farmers and ranchers. Since becoming a commissioner, I've had the privilege of traveling all across the United States to wheat fields in Kansas, soybean farms in Michigan, rice farms in Louisiana and Arkansas, cotton gin in Georgia, cornfields across the Midwest in Iowa, Minnesota, South and North Dakota, cattle ranches in Montana, just to name a few. And that includes the farms and places of business of many of the participants on this call and members of this committee. And let me just say that I'm incredibly grateful for those relationships that developed from those travels, and in many cases, those friendships. I've been consistently impressed and humbled by these Americans' work ethic, their sophistication and dedication to growing their businesses, many of which are family-owned in the face of historically low commodity prices, international trade disputes, and intense competition. The combination of steep declines in commodity prices and global supply and demand forces has put unrelenting pressure on America's farmers to increase yields, cut costs, and drive efficiencies to remain profitable. The severe supply and demand shocks caused by the COVID-19 challenges are the latest of many circumstances the Heartland has withstood in recent years. These difficult events make it all the more vital that farmers and ranchers feel like they can depend upon liquid, well-functioning agricultural futures and swaps markets to hedge their risk. Recently, I have noted that some have expressed concerns regarding the performance of certain futures contracts, and I take those concerns seriously. I encourage market participants to continue voicing those concerns and experiences to the exchanges, to the CFTC staff, and to us as commissioners. In particular, I commend the chairman for convening a livestock market task force to examine conditions in the cattle markets and ensure contracts are working as intended. For over 150 years, the U.S. futures markets have enabled farmers and ranchers to hedge their commercial risk in the most liquid, competitive, and vibrant futures markets in the world. This is no small accomplishment. It's taken generations of hardworking, creative, and aspirational thinkers to build both today's agricultural industry as well as today's futures marketplace. And I'm committed to working to strengthen the trust that the agriculture community has in our futures markets and ensure the long-standing tradition continues for America's next generation of farmers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Quintens. Commissioner Benham?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me, Summer? It's Commissioner Benham?
Yes. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to first off thank Chairman Tarbert for sponsoring and hosting this afternoon's meeting. Certainly a challenge, as we noted earlier with the telephonic meeting, but one that I think will be effective, and I appreciate his efforts to put this forward given the conditions. Also want to thank him for starting the task force, given a lot of the challenges and the volatility we've seen in the market and the issues that we've heard as a commission. Couldn't appreciate that more. I think it's the best way that we can engage with market participants and above all else show them proof that we care, that we are constantly thinking about these issues, and that we want to find solutions as soon as possible. Special thanks to Secretary Perdue and his leadership and his words, taking time this afternoon to share some of his thoughts on the COVID crisis and what he's doing as Secretary over at the department to help ensure that the ag economy and the producers all across the country are enduring here and getting out on the right end of this challenge. Certainly a lot of issues ahead, but again, as has been said, Secretary Perdue is the right man for the job here. I do want to recognize that it's a great relationship that we've had. The chairman has mentioned it many times, the CFTC and USDA. We had Secretary Vilsack. I think he came to the CFTC back in 2014, so we have a long history of engagement with USDA. And as the Chairman Tarbert said, I have full confidence that we'll continue that with the liaison and constant communication to ensure that we're doing what we need to do on our end to promote and to make the futures markets as effective and useful as possible. Also want to quickly thank Summer and Krista Lackenmeyer, Summer particularly for her role as DFO, and Krista for her input, as always, on agricultural issues. Finally, want to thank the members of the AAC. I know a lot is going on. Certainly wish all of you well, your families, a lot of transition in the past few months, but certainly appreciate your willingness to be on the call and provide the Commission with input. A lot of challenges in the ag economy, more so than many, thinking about the frontline individuals who have had the courage, including our healthcare workers, but ag is right there, putting food on the table for Americans in the world, as you always have. It certainly means a lot to me, and I know it means a lot to the Commission and folks across the country. So thanks for your continued hard work and your willingness to fight this very challenging fight we're going on through right now. I sponsored the AAC a few years ago before we had a full commission, and I had the privilege of hosting a meeting for the first time outside of D.C. in Kansas City, and we discussed crop insurance and farm credit. It seems like many, many years ago, but those were relevant issues at the time, and I think given the challenges we're facing today, crop insurance and farm credit are among the many issues that I think growers and producers are dealing with right now. So we continue to sort of parse through all the challenges that folks are facing and trying to come up with solutions to ensure that our markets are functioning well. Given the market volatility and thinking about what was mentioned earlier about the spreads between box beef and cattle prices, I want to commend a lot of the market participants, the exchanges, for their engagement, their continued increased engagement with producers and market participants. We've learned, I think, as a commission that communication is key more so than ever now that we're all working remotely. And I think it's important that all members of this sort of ecosystem, the exchanges included, which they've done a great job, continue to engage to resolve some of these issues about the limit days, the delivery challenges, settlement, and the spreads to ensure that we do have market integrity and that we are, as regulators and overseers and as exchangers, that we're doing what we need to do to ensure that the markets are fairly reflective of price discovery and allow risk management, as we've said. The ag economy has faced headwinds for many, many years. It's endured many different challenges over decades, and I'm confident we'll get through this one. Most recently, as the Secretary mentioned, trade issues, weather issues, they don't seem to stop, and we will continue to fight, I think, as a commission and as a member of this conversation and this group to ensure that the markets are functioning well and we're doing what we need to do to allow farmers to hedge these risks. CFTC is a partner. We've long been a partner, and we continue to be one. So I'm often reminded of thinking about growers, producers as the best stewards of their land, and they certainly are. And it's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, so it's I think timely to think about and have this discussion with our producers, folks across the country who are working hard to produce food for the states, of course, and for the globe. And as they are the best stewards of their land, I do want to commend and thank them for all the work they're doing. And certainly ensure that I'm doing what I can and working with my colleagues as the chairman and Commissioner Quintens and my other colleagues will do what we can to ensure that the markets are functioning well. So with that, look forward to today's comments. Thanks again for your participation. And I will turn it back to you, Sonny. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Benham. Commissioner Stump?
Thank you, Summer. This is Commissioner Stump, and I wanted to thank you and Krista and the chairman for calling this meeting or organizing the meeting. I very much appreciate all of the committee members and the panelists, and especially Secretary Perdue for participating. Having had the opportunity to work through many prior challenges with USDA makes today's meeting a bit bittersweet for me. In a prior capacity, I spent almost a decade working on ag policy as a staffer in the House and the Senate, which afforded me the opportunity to work with USDA on the implementation of 2 farm bills and several disaster programs. I think everybody on the commission knows that. What you may not know is that my husband also worked at the Department of Agriculture, and in the grim days following 9/11, he became the agency's first Homeland Security Director. And I mention this just because while my family and I are very proud to have worked with USDA in some previous difficult times, no challenge is quite like any other. And today we're again called to work together in managing yet another unprecedented circumstance that impacts our ag markets. And I'm so pleased that we're having this meeting to try and get our arms around it. As for the CFTC's part in all of this, we have an obligation to preserve the integrity of the futures market specifically, so that everyone involved in the production, distribution, and consumption of food and fiber can reliably discover prices on transparent market venues. But we don't do this in isolation. Price discovery in these futures markets relies on various inputs tied to the underlying cash market. So we rely on partners such as the Department of Agriculture to help us maintain this integrity. As the past few weeks have shown, price discovery is sometimes a grim job. Today, we are particularly sensitive to and acknowledge the real-world implications of recent commodity prices, but we must nonetheless ensure that the price is transparent and reliable, regardless of its favorability. Only then are these markets able to actually serve their risk management function as intended. We also take very seriously our obligation to ensure that those who attempt to manipulate these markets are held accountable. And we have such a remarkable forum here today. I know many of the people on this committee. I've known them for many years, and we are very blessed to have so many people willing to take times out of their busy days to help us discuss these issues and think through them in a way in very dynamic circumstances. And I just want to commend all of those who are willing to participate, who give of their time and their energy. And as I said, we have many partners in preserving the integrity of the various commodities we regulate, but none more important than the market participants who help us have a view into what's happening on the ground. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Summer.
Thank you, Commissioner Stump. Commissioner Berkowitz?
Thank you, Summer, and congratulations on your first meeting, and thank you, Krista, for all the work you do to support our agricultural market oversight program. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your sponsorship of the committee and your leadership in conducting this meeting today. We had one of these a few weeks ago with the Energy and Environmental Management Advisory Committee, and it's particularly critical in a time like this that we engage in this dialogue with members of the affected markets so that they can hear from us about what we are doing to ensure market integrity, and as important, we learn from market participants firsthand about conditions in the market. I'm pleased particularly to welcome Secretary of Agriculture Perdue to the meeting today. Commitment and cooperation among all levels and branches of government are critically important as our country seeks to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic consequences, including in the agricultural sector. We are meeting with the Secretary and his leadership staff in this spirit today. America's farmers, ranchers, and other participants in the agricultural commodity have long been a focus of the Commission's work in promoting price discovery and effective risk management in derivatives markets and ensuring that these markets are free from fraud and abuse. Last summer, I had the privilege of traveling the country to meet with farmers, ranchers, and agricultural market participants throughout the United States. Each of these visits emphasized the importance of agriculture to the U.S. economy and to our national well-being through safe, abundant, and affordable domestic food supplies. I saw firsthand how American farmers and ranchers were diligently working to overcome the threats posed by floods, tariff wars, and collapsing prices. And I might add that on my travels last summer, I happened to intersect with Secretary Perdue's travels, and we were both attended a dinner with farmers and ranchers and leaders of the agricultural community in Minneapolis. And I had a good conversation with the Secretary at that dinner, and we talked about convergence in our agricultural markets. And I think it's great that we have a Secretary that understands our markets and that is committed to supporting our markets, and so is so knowledgeable about our markets and supportive of our mission. So I look forward to continuing to work with Secretary Perdue and his staff on issues of mutual interest, and I'm pleased to see that we will have a new liaison to the Department of Agriculture. The COVID-19 pandemic has added a myriad of new existential challenges to our agricultural sector. In this environment, it is critical that our commodity markets serve their purpose to help overcome these challenges and not contribute to them. We must ensure that the commodity markets continue to serve their intended function of risk management and price discovery so that farmers, ranchers, and others in the agricultural sector can manage the risks posed by the current situation. I look forward to the discussion today, including with respect to livestock markets and processing facilities. I thank each of today's panelists for making the time to help inform the Commission so we can better ensure that CFTC regulated agricultural markets are working effectively for all farmers, ranchers, and commercial businesses involved in feeding America during these challenging times. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Commissioner Berkovitz. And thanks again to the committee and the commissioners for making time to take part in this important meeting today and for sharing your remarks with the committee. I also want to echo the thanks to Krista Lachenmeyer, who has been very involved in preparing for this meeting today. And I also want to say thank you to Ann Wright, Deputy Director of the Office of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs, and Jenna Tebby, an intern with the Office of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs, who were also very important parts of today's call. With that, at this time, I would like to do roll call of the committee members on the line. When I call your name, please indicate that you are present. Buddy Allen, American Cotton Shippers Association. Next, we'll go to Joe Parker, National Council of Farmer Cooperatives.
Present.
Chris Betts, Michigan Agribusiness Association.
Present.
Larry Bergen, National Farmers Union.
Present.
Darrell Blakely, National Cattlemen's Beef Association.
Present.
Robbie Boone, Farm Credit Council.
Present.
Amanda Breslin, Coalition for Derivative End Users. Present. Patrick Coyle, National Grain and Feed Association.
Present.
Rob Kriener, with the Principal Trading Group and Futures Industry Association.
Present.
Neil Dirks, National Pork Producers Council.
Present.
Ed Elfman, American Bankers Association.
Present.
Ed Gallagher, National Milk Producers Federation.
Present.
Tommy Hayden, Commodities Markets Council. Matt Hines, American Farm Bureau Federation.
Present.
Thomas Hogan, Cocoa Merchants Association of America.
Present.
Tom Kadlik, Futures Industry Association. Chris Clinton, National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. Ron Lee, National Cotton Council of America.
Present.
Randy Melvin, National Corn Growers Association.
Present.
John Owen, USA Rice Federation.
Present.
Monty Peterson, American Soybean Association. Paul Lineker, National Farmers Organization. Mark Scanlon, Independent Community Bankers of America. Stephen Strong, American Export Grain Association. And I think we're maybe having a problem with some folks' line, so we'll just finish the roll call here, and we might have to check back to see who we missed. Justin Tepper, U.S. Cattlemen's Association.
Summer, this is Buddy Allen, American Cotton Shippers. I apologize. I had a muted line, but I'm on.
No problem. Thank you.
Justin Tupper's present.
Thank you. Hayden Wands, American Bakers Association. Ryan Weston, American Sugar Alliance. And Chris Young, International Swaps and Derivatives Association.
Present.
Thank you. We can go back and touch base with those that we didn't hear from in case you were having problems with your line after the call. As noted in today's agenda, next we'll have remarks from Derek Salmon. He's the Global Head of Commodities and Options Products and a Senior Managing Director at CME Group. Derek will be followed by David Farrell. He's the Chief Operating Officer of ICE Futures US. And with that, I'll turn it over to Derek for his presentation.
Thank you, Summer. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Terrific. This is Derek Salmon from CME Group. And let me start by saying thank you to Commissioner Tarbert and the entire Ag Advisory Committee for the opportunity today to provide a brief overview on the state of the agricultural markets. I especially want to thank the industry associations represented here today, with whom we've been engaged throughout these difficult times. Your engagement is extremely beneficial to helping us provide the best markets for commercial customers. The disruptions that COVID-19 has caused in the global economy and in the agricultural markets in particular is unprecedented. These extraordinary circumstances have led to disruptions in the food supply chain, the results of which can be seen primarily in livestock and dairy markets, where the physical supply chain is adapting to a shift in demand from food service to grocery channels and uncertainty around processing capacity. Cattle and hog futures prices at CME Group were particularly impacted by these shifts. We observed and heard from our customers about the unusually wide basis between spot prices and futures prices. We know this was confusing for many market participants as they saw robust current demand as consumers cleared out the meat case at the local grocer, while futures markets were pricing in the impacts of closed food service outlets, the potential for additional shelter-in-place orders, and the possibility that COVID-19 might infect and shut down processing plants, all factors which have now come to pass. The measure of the effectiveness of a futures contract is not if a futures contract matches today's spot price, which it rarely will in volatile and uncertain markets. Instead, it is how effectively it enables the convergence between the futures price and the cash price by the end of the delivery period. For example, in the cash-settled March feeder cattle contract, we recently saw the basis converge from $22 between the cash spot and futures to 36 cents in a week. Based on the first cattle auction in the settlement period, which was $22 below the futures price, we proactively took action to widen the daily price limits to ensure that convergence would not be impeded. Based on successive cattle auctions in the settlement window, which were at and above the futures price, the index caught up to the futures price, and those wider daily price limits were eventually not needed for the two prices to successfully converge. Last week, we saw an orderly convergence in the cash-settled April hog contract. Over the past year, we have consistently seen convergence successfully occur across our livestock contracts, both the physically settled live cattle contract and the financially settled feeder cattle contract, where the futures price and the cash prices successfully converged. In the case of livestock, it's important to note the broad delivery territory as it relates to different cash prices. Convergence means the futures price and the cash price in at least one of those locations equal each other, but not necessarily at all of those locations. Additionally, it means the two prices will converge by the end of the delivery period, not necessarily before the delivery period or on the first day. It's worth highlighting that liquidity in the live cattle contract has improved significantly over the past few years as the exchange has made contract enhancements which have boosted deliverable supply and addressed the potential for congestion during the delivery period. This is consistent with how we regularly review our futures contracts and seek customer feedback on ways to make these products as efficient as possible for customers to manage their risk in livestock markets. As a result, this contract is much better positioned to withstand this current market uncertainty. We remain equally vigilant around the grains and dairy markets. Many of the fundamental factors impacting livestock are also impacting the dairy markets, where we see heightened volatility in both milk and cheese products. The impact on grains was less severe. However, low crude oil prices and reduced global energy consumption have filtered back into ethanol demand, where corn prices reached a 14-year low. We continue to closely monitor our contract's performance, especially as it relates to enabling the successful convergence of futures and cash prices in our markets. We also continue to work closely with the ag industry to ensure that all our contracts remain effective hedging tools by ensuring that we have appropriate price limit mechanisms in place to allow price discovery and convergence to efficiently occur in a timely manner. CME Group remains committed to continuing to work with the ag industry and maintaining an open line of communication to build and improve the effectiveness of our futures and options contracts for robust risk management and efficient price discovery. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to the committee.
Thank you, Derek. Dave, are you on the line?
Yes, Summer, can you hear me?
Yes, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. My name is David Farrell, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for ICE Futures US. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Chairman Tarbert, the commissioners, and the industry associations represented on the committee for allowing us the opportunity to update the committee on the status of our agricultural markets. In such extraordinary times and with unprecedented disruptions on both the supply side and the demand side, the futures markets remain critical in providing their three primary functions to the agricultural supply chains. First, risk management. We continue to offer contracts that allow firms to offset their commercial risks that exist in their business and manage their risk. Second, price discovery. We provide a place for today's unique supply and demand dynamics to play out publicly to determine the price of a standard specification of product. And third, the futures serve as a buyer and seller of last resort and allow for convergence with the physical market. For example, if a seller has a surplus of stock, they can use the futures markets to pass it on to other participants that may need it. And likewise, a buyer with a genuine commercial need and no access to supply can utilize the futures markets to service that need. Our agricultural markets, including the domestic crops that we have, are global in nature. They serve as benchmarks for goods traded around the world electronically, which has allowed for a relatively uneventful transition of participants from office environments to working from home and other working arrangements. Participants have been able to access the market to carry out their required business and to manage their risk. The impact we do see with the onset of the COVID-19 epidemic has a distinct fingerprint that we can see across our agricultural markets, and it's evident in the patterns of volumes and volatility in those markets. Each of our agricultural futures markets and options markets have seen above average volume and volatility year to date, with a minimum of a double-digit increase in the volume for that market. The pattern of that activity has followed a similar path in each market. At the beginning of the year, broadly speaking, across our ag markets, we saw average volume and we saw average volatility relative to last year. Beginning in February and through the start of March, we began to see some extended periods of increased activity and above average volume. Following that volume increase, we saw implied volatilities respond and increase as well, mainly throughout March and into early April timeframe. However, in recent weeks, as we've progressed through April, we've seen a return to more average or below average in some circumstances trading activity. So the overall arc of activity is similar across many of these markets. After the initial uncertainty around COVID-19 has come to pass, markets are starting to settle in and trade and progress in a more normal fashion. While the derivatives trading activity in our markets is 100% electronic, there are aspects of our future supply chain that could experience constraints. Some activities require people to be congregated together and to perform a function. This could manifest itself in warehousing or sampling operations, transportation, as well as the grading function, specifically for coffee and cocoa. Coffee and cocoa grading occurs in our exchange facility in New York by a panel of licensed experts, most of whom are based in the New York vicinity. Considering New York is one of the high-risk regions, we've taken precautions to ensure the safety of the graders and our staff who assist and help facilitate the grading. These precautions have reduced the potential capacity of our grading function. However, to date, we continue to be able to facilitate grading where necessary. While the delivery mechanism and delivery locations vary greatly for each of our markets, we're monitoring the key functions which are critical for an exchange delivery in eligible locations. We're reviewing our contingency plans and potential mitigations, as well as advising participants of the market of conditions that exist where necessary. Logistical complications are always possible for physically settled contracts, but ultimately we're preparing ourselves to ensure that the markets remain available for trading, that participants are able to manage their commercial risks, and that price discovery continues in an orderly manner. Thank you again to the Commission for inviting us to update you on our markets. We wish everybody on the committee and at the Commission good health and safety as we work through these very difficult times. Thank you. Back to you, Summer.
Thank you, David. And thank you both for your insight and taking time to join us today. I will note we've received some messages from those individuals from the committee that are on the call, but were unable to unmute their lines to stay present, and we will adjust the record accordingly to account for those individuals. Now, I'd like to open the meeting up for some questions. For those of you listening in, the committee members sent questions ahead of time, and thank you all for doing that. I'll read the questions and probably address them to our panelists. As the Secretary mentioned, we also have USDA's Chief Economist, Dr. Rob Johansson, on the line. Tom Lasala, the Chief Regulatory Officer for CME, is also on our line. And we have a few people from our Division of Market Oversight, specifically David Amato from with our Market Intelligence Branch. We'll do the best we can to get to as many questions as possible today. If you have other questions and you'd like to ask them during the discussion, if you press *0, that should take you to the operator to alert the operator. With that, I'm going to kick off our question and answer session, and we'll start with a question for Chairman Tarbert. Chairman, groups such as dairy, cattle, and corn farmers are experiencing large price volatility in the industry. The demands for these products are high, yet ranchers and farmers are struggling. How does the CFTC plan to make sure these markets are working properly?
Thanks so much, Summer. I mean, in a nutshell, we're putting all of our efforts into making sure that we understand during this period of immense volatility exactly what's going on in our markets. And particularly, as I mentioned, we put together the livestock task force specifically for that reason. And so we are talking to the exchanges, we're talking market participants, we're talking to the clearinghouses, just to make sure that we get a sense of basically any indication that prices are moving in an uneconomic manner relative to the underlying commodities cash prices. You know, so in other words, the question we're asking as we're looking at everything is, does all this make sense? Or is something else going on here? Could it be caused by a trader exerting market power or attempting to manipulate futures prices? And if so, we will refer that matter to enforcement for an investigation. And so that is what we are doing. We're watching the markets very carefully, and in particular, given the volatility in sort of the live cattle, the feeder cattle contracts, we've put together this livestock task force.
Thank you, Chairman. With regard to the livestock task force, when you're communicating with industry groups and the general public about the work the CFTC is doing during this time, are you able to publicize those efforts, such as what surveillance is undertaking or if there are investigations? And are you able to, as a commission, able to post an update on any type of ongoing investigation in an industry segment?
So, Summer, we can certainly give indications and give information as to what we're seeing in the markets. Our Market Intelligence Bureau does a lot of that. Calls like this provide that insight. So on what's happening in the markets, and I try to give commentary where possible in the various media, as well as my fellow commissioners often do the same. The one area, though, that I think we don't really publicize unless we've decided to take a concrete action is on the enforcement side. So if, in fact, we file a case, we bring a case against someone, we detect something, we will go ahead and often publicize that through a media release. And we can always make sure that the members on this call get those in a timely manner. What we don't normally do is publicize our surveillance activities and our investigation activities. And the reason for that, of course, is, number one, we want to make sure we get it right. We do a thorough investigation. We gather all the evidence, and we give the people that we're looking at sort of the benefit of the doubt before we decide to bring an action. So don't want to do anything prematurely. The other thing, of course, is that, we need to be smart about how we go about our surveillance to ensure that particularly if we're monitoring certain things or we identify certain patterns, that we don't expose those patterns such that we're unable to gather the evidence we need if we think there's wrongdoing. So that's the way we bifurcate it. I think in terms of market information and being able to say what we're seeing out there, we're happy to publicize those efforts. On the other stuff, the surveillance and the investigation, again, there you should know that we're doing it, but we can't reveal the details prematurely.
Thank you. The next question, there's probably a few people on the panel who are able to answer this, so I'll throw it out there and let folks provide their feedback on this. This is a question we received from a number of our advisory committee members. We've all seen the news about the crude oil market, and a number of the members submitted questions related to this week's activity. Would it be possible to get an overview of the crude oil markets and what happened in this past week, what the implications are for a negative price for the May contract, and is it possible that contracts in the egg complex, like live cattle, feeder cattle, lean hogs, dairy, grains, could also at some point go negative?
Hi, this is Derek Salmon. I think I'll maybe be the first to step into this one. Thank you, Summer. So let me address the first part of that at the outset. So the negative pricing in the front month May WTI contract futures on Monday was driven by three fundamental factors impacting the global oil market. Number one, significant oversupply of crude globally, particularly here in the U.S. with U.S. shale continued production. Number two, significantly reduced demand for global oil due to the COVID-19 impacts of shut-ins in states and nobody flying and nobody traveling. And thirdly, the concerns about increasing full U.S. storage capacity here in the U.S. for the WTI contract products. During Monday's trading day, the already steep contango continued to steepen, eventually pushing the May contract below zero for the last few hours of trading. While this kind of contango is rare, this steep, it is simply a reflection of the oversupply of the U.S. crude market seeking storage. So our WTI contract did what it was designed to do, which basically is to reflect the underlying supply and demand dynamics of efficiently converging towards the underlying cash physical price. So to your second portion of the question, in terms of ag products, negative prices in ag markets are unlikely, primarily because the ability to create near-term storage options is much cheaper and much easier than creating near-term storage capabilities for crude oil. For example, grains and oilseeds. It's virtually impossible to have a zero or negative price because grains and oilseeds can be stored in the ground and covered with a tarp, for example. In addition, delivery instruments do not require the buyer to take physical stocks of grain, which he may be incapable of handling. In live cattle, for example, it's very unlikely, despite grave concerns around beef processing capacity due to COVID-19. Slaughter-ready cattle can always be put back on feed or even put up to pasture. Well, if not ideal, and it certainly would imply very cheap cattle, but it probably wouldn't create negative prices for cattle. Lean hogs. Lean hogs are cash settled to the CME Lean Hog Index. For the index to go negative, hogs in the cash market would need to trade at negative prices. This could really only happen if most, if not all, hog slaughter capability was lost across the entire nation, and the price of hogs in the cash market reflected the cost to destroy them. Hogs can be put in pens for some period of time, so that's an unlikely scenario. And finally, on the dairy, butter may represent an agricultural product that may potentially have a risk of trading at negative prices, but it's very unlikely in our estimation, primarily because it can be stored for a limited period of time, and find an alternative climate-controlled warehouse space is much cheaper and easier than finding alternative storage for crude oil, which is far more complex and costly. So that's on the CME side.
Thank you, Derek.
Hi, it's David Farrell from ICE. And I want to tread really carefully here just to make sure we don't cause any alarm. And I want to ensure that I avoid any confusing a conversation around theoretical possibility with a conversation around likelihood. In the realm of theoretical possibility, yes, negative prices are possible. They'd be extremely unlikely, but possible. Each market has its own set of potential legitimate constraints on supply, storage, transportation, delivery, something on the demand side, which could lead to extreme prices, whether they be high, low, negative. In particular, this could happen if the prevailing conditions occur very close to a contract's expiration, and there was some additional time constraint. The conditions would certainly need to be extreme. They would likely be restricted to a specific geographic area, and they would also probably very likely be very short-lived. So again, it's a theoretical possibility, but it's not a likely event in our ag markets.
Thank you, David. The next question, I'll let you kind of start by answering this one. Based on how the markets are functioning during the pandemic, are there any rules or regulations that are currently in place that have benefited the operation of the market? Or do you all see anything that needs to be established for anything in the future?
I think broadly speaking, the principles that we have at the exchange and the principles that we utilize with our rule book and the way that we operate the market has allowed us to preserve those core functions. And it's not to say that in very extreme times you won't have extreme volatility, but the purpose of the market is still functioning. It's still providing risk management for participants. It's still providing price discovery, which is very important in these times, particularly as all the different supply dynamics and demand dynamics come together in one place. And ultimately, it will provide a buyer and seller of last resort to allow convergence.
From the CME side, I would say the most important thing that we're seeing in this market is the continued dialogue with the CFTC at multiple levels and our customers. Where we have needed to take decisive actions to ensure the continued smooth operation of the markets, we have done so. The point that I made on feeder cattle earlier in my prepared remarks are a great example of that, where we wanted to make sure that where we saw a spread between the underlying cash price on the first day of the settlement window versus our futures price, we needed to make sure that we were able to adjust that daily price limit so that didn't impede the ability for those markets to converge. So our partnership and communication and coordination with the Commission, as well as with the commercial customers and keeping an open dialogue, have us comfortable that as we are seeing issues that are extraordinarily impacting this market, we're comfortable that we have the right input from customers and the right support from the Commission when we need to get things done for the benefit of the market.
Great, thank you. And speaking of the Commission, I'm going to quickly turn to Dave Amato in our Division of Market Oversight. He's also on the call today. and just kind of a general question, Dave, are the markets reacting as you would expect them to react given the current conditions?
Hi, Summer. Yes, this is Dave Amato. As Summer said, I'm an economist in the Division of Market Oversight, Market Intelligence Branch. I also head up the livestock task force that the CFTC has put together, and thank you, Chairman Tarbert, for that opportunity. In terms of the question, I guess kind of go over a few highlights. In terms of the price movements that we're seeing, I would say that the market is reacting the way we would expect. But the big caveat there is we're living in very, very historic times, as many of our speakers have talked about. I don't believe anyone on this call has experienced anything like this in any other ag environment or commodity markets that we're aware of, at least not in our lifetimes. You have the packing plants around the country. They're now the most significant hotspots for COVID-19. Looking at some statistics that have come out, currently about 8% of the U.S. packing capacity is offline, and most of the plants are operating anywhere from 50 to 75% of normal production. A lot of that is due to employee absenteeism. So given those estimates, the total meat packing industry is operating about 60% of normal capacity. We have, very strange things happening. We have milk. About 8% of milk production is being dumped. We have poultry producers getting letters from, processors telling them to kill some of their chickens in the field. In terms of hogs, we have normally we process about 2.5 million hogs per week. It's estimated that if the virus continues, we'll be only able to process about 2.1 million. So that leaves about 400,000 hogs per week backing up. As some of our guests have said, there are some things you can do to sort of alleviate that. But at the end of the day, when you have that many hogs with no home to find, we're probably going to have to see some euthanization of hogs as well. So these are just definitely very, very strange times. I think it's very similar to what we saw in the Tyson hokum fire that the U.S. Ag Secretary referenced earlier, except it's at a much, much greater level. Instead of having one plant down, you're having multiple plants down, lots of different locations across the country, and it's impacting all the meats. I think in terms of volatility, it's just been extremely volatile, particularly if we look at livestock, which I know has come up a lot. The fundamentals are sometimes changing daily, sometimes pulling prices in different directions. Normally, volatility is caused by either fear or uncertainty, and the situation that we're in right now has both. You have the virus scaring people, closing packing plants, making people sick and die. And just kind of give you a little background, we looked at March 1st through April 14th for the June live cattle contract, and that contract, those 31 days, it had 14 days where it either traded limit up or limit down. So that's about 45% of the trading days over that 31-day period. You saw limit moves, and so it's going to take a lot of research to find a more volatile time than that. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing normally when you have volatility like we're seeing today, you expect to see a lot of open interest. Usually the investor class likes volatility as an opportunity to make money. But what we're seeing pretty much across the board, with a few exceptions, but most of the commodities have much lower open interest today on an all futures and options combined basis than they did at the start of the year. And I think that fear factor has actually removed people from some of the markets as opposed to drawing them in. And then just a couple other notes on the commitment to traders. I think the CFTC's commitment to traders can provide a little bit of insight to the public on what's been happening in our markets. And so just sort of a few observations, again, focusing on cattle because in livestock because so much attention has been placed on that. In the cash market, you have farmers and ranchers and packers and processors, and they're dealing in an exclusive commercial market. But obviously in the futures markets, we have a large investor class that participates in these markets. And so what we've seen, if you look at the data, especially if you look at things like livestock, since January and once the virus hit, we've seen a tremendous sell-off by non-commercials, and this is available on the CFTC website for the Commitments to Traders reports. And you can see pretty much across the board in most of the ag products, there's been a large sell-off by non-commercials, and you see buying at lower prices by the commercial class. And so I think a lot of the sell-off that we've seen, the downward pressure in prices, is due to this non-commercial exit, changing positions from being net long to either less long or possibly even in some cases net short. So I think to summarize, the general price action is very consistent with the supply and demand that we're seeing, but it's just incredibly unprecedented. Someone mentioned oil just a few minutes ago. I think oil is a perfect example. You had oil back in June of 2008 trade for almost $150 a barrel. And then this week we're seeing, negative minus $37 prices. So is that consistent with the supply and demand? Very possibly, but it's just incredible times that we're living in. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Just to follow up on that, you mentioned convergence. Can you give us kind of some circumstances where there may be a lack of convergence with markets? And then also, if there's anything that we should consider or be prepared for moving forward in the months ahead, based on the current uncertainty.
Again, to go to like livestock in live cattle, the April basis has been very wide. Cash transactions had been relatively small or very, very light the past few weeks. However, over the last several days, we have seen that basis come in nicely. It's obviously been a big concern for us because the cash and futures were so wide. We got, at one point, the basis was about $19 cash over futures. It's come in today to about $3.50. So as we approach LTD, last trading day, on April 30th, we're definitely moving in the right direction. As someone mentioned, cattle is a physically delivered contract. We don't expect to see any deliveries at this point because cash is still over futures. But those two prices are coming together. And so I think it would be an incredible accomplishment if we do have this convergence. It's what we expect, but we are living, as I said, in very, very difficult times. And so if something like live cattle, which is has the potential to deliver physical animals, if you could have convergence in a market like that, I would say that our markets are functioning extremely well. And as was pointed out by, I think, the CME gentleman, the CME has made adjustments as needed, as we saw in the feeder cattle contract back in March when they changed the price limits for the futures contract to ensure convergence. So there's rule changes and tweaks like that that can sometimes be made to ensure that we get to convergence.
Thank you, Dave. The next question, I'll actually turn to Dr. Johansson. So your boss mentioned a number of supply chain issues that you guys are watching, and just wondering if you could go a little bit deeper into what you all are doing with respect to keeping the food chain supply operational, and how you're monitoring that and working with other agencies to alleviate bottlenecks in the system.
Yeah, thanks again for inviting for us to participate and provide some comments. Just to echo what some of the speakers have already mentioned regarding well-functioning markets, and in addition, the numerous sort of historic conditions that we're facing right now. Of course, when we talk about the food supply chain, we're moving, talking about all the way from the farm operation all the way to the grocery store, or obviously previously to other marketing outlets. Transportation is a big part of that. So we've been working with DOT to ensure that, for example, some of their hours of service regulations have some exemptions for critical products. We've also been, of course, closely monitoring the situation in the packing plants and working with DHS and CDC and others on the various task forces that are arranged at the White House right now to deal with these issues to ensure that discussions of PPE and other protective measures are also deliberately considering the ag supply chain. So in those discussions, we're participating to make sure that that whatever policies are being put in place are also considering the agricultural sector and the agriculture food supply chain. The Secretary has certainly been on more calls than I can relay with different state governors and other officials regarding policies in those regions around some of the packing plants to understand what's ongoing. And of course, we've been in touch with the companies as well. We understand that a lot of the packing companies are putting in place measures to try and establish social distancing when possible, and adjusting some of the operation of those facilities to ensure that that when possible and to the extent possible, those protective measures can be put in place. Of course, we also have a number of our employees that are directly impacted and that are participating with ensuring the smooth functioning of those facilities, and we're obviously making sure that all of our employees are adequately protected as well. So again, there are lots of moving pieces. We're engaging with a lot of the folks that are probably on the call today in terms of understanding what they're seeing in terms of the economic impacts on their stakeholders, and making sure that we're aware of what those are as we start putting in place some of the programs and policies that the Secretary mentioned, the President mentioned earlier on both the food purchase, which is also going to help on the supply chain side, as well as the payments to producers to help them with their impacts. Now, I know that we also have some other folks from USDA on the line that may want to point out some more specifics on this. So I'm just going to see if Dudley Hoskins is available to continue on making comments on this particular issue.
Yeah, Rob, thank you. And this is Dudley Hoskins, USDA, in the Secretary's office. Dr. Johansson, I think, did a great job of framing out just the landscape of challenges and issues, and maybe just to go a little deeper on some of that in a granular level. So the Secretary has directed us to do a number of different things. I think his metaphor at the top of the call was, about something like a car wreck on the interstate and the backlog that creates. What we saw when the restaurant and food service industry came offline, really kind of overnight, there was an incredible shock to that supply chain. Not telling anything you all don't know, but in response to that, one of the things the Secretary directed us to do was to find and facilitate as much regulatory flexibility as we could to help redirect as much of that product from food service, restaurant, et cetera, into the grocery store retail market. And some of the things that we did unilaterally within USDA and some in partnership with our colleagues at FDA, the Secretary amended some of the federal milk marketing orders that have very specific restrictions on volume and flow in certain regions. That was an effort to try to redirect more fluid milk that was disrupted from some of the school lunch programs and help broaden the infrastructure that product could go to in the processing space. He had also worked, directed AMS to bring more flexibility to some of the shell eggs that were initially set to go into food service and restaurants, and allow them to be regraded, relabeled, repackaged, and redirected into the grocery store sector. And then he's done some other things, trying to exercise some discretion on some of the cool enforcement for product that was currently in storage. That will still not apply to imported product, but will provide more flexibility to try to pull some of those, especially some of those specialty crops, back into the retail sector. And honestly, a lot of this is done in real time. It's wherever we can, we're finding as much flexibility for our producers, for our stakeholders, for our customers, for the entire universe of folks that are on the call now. And not to say we've done it all and it's been perfect, but wherever we can, trying to mitigate the immediate shock, both to the supply chain, but ultimately the disruption and frustration is probably not the right word. There's a better word, but in the most technical sense, the frustration for producers trying to move those products in the market, and so those are just some of the specific actions the Secretary's directed us to do, in addition to the things that Dr. Johansson laid out about working with the White House Task Force and the Vice President's office and our colleagues in DOT and FEMA and DHS and EPA across the board. So I'll stop there, but just wanted to add a little more color to what Dr. Johansson was framing out. Thank you.
Thanks, Dudley. And I also understand you are a distinguished former member of the AAC, so we're excited to have you on in a different capacity today. Another issue that the Secretary touched on, and just wondering if anyone from USDA can provide a few more details on the trade deals, specifically how has COVID-19 impacted phase one of the China deal, and how will it impact some of the other trade deals that were underway before this pandemic hit?
Yeah, it's a great question. Of course, we were very excited, in the beginning of January to sign the phase one deal with China. And certainly we're moving full speed ahead on that before, obviously, the Chinese ag sector was significantly impacted in January, late January and into February. And then, of course, we are where we're at here in the U.S. So I guess we're still moving forward on a lot of that agreement. But it is still relatively early in that agreement. We have till December to meet those purchase amounts. We still are operating under the assumption that China is going to be able to meet those purchase agreements, although obviously with global GDP taking such a large impact, obviously purchasing power for a lot of things, including a lot of ag products, is going to be down going forward. And when essentially the rebound occurs in GDP growth is certainly questionable. I think most people were expecting a pretty quick recovery. That's quick meaning after a V-shaped type of recovery, but depending on how reopening goes in countries, we'll have to continue to monitor what growth patterns look like. So in terms of the Chinese agreement, yes, we're still moving forward on that. We still have a lot of interaction with the Chinese ag teams. Of course, that includes more than purchases, including, for example, the regionalization agreement for poultry and HPAI, which was fortuitous given the fact that we just had an issue with HPAI recently. USMCA is we're still working on implementations. There are some delays there, but not directly related to coronavirus. As with any of these agreements, they do take a long time to get across the finish line, and then, of course, once implementation starts, it does take a little bit of time to get up to speed on them. For the Japan agreement, we did see some promising results in our meat trade in January and February. We're still, getting data in a lot from our trade, from monitoring those trade flows. a lot of times that data is a little bit delayed. So I would say that at this point in time, it's still a little early to tell how much coronavirus has affected our sort of the progress that we were making with the Japan trade agreement. Let me just stop there and see if Dudley wanted to add anything in addition to some of those SPS issues.
Yeah, Rob, and this is Dudley. I think you covered the landscape there. I think one other topic just while it's front of mind. So last summer, fall, I'm losing track of some of this. The Department of Commerce and Mexico facilitated a tomato suspension agreement. That agreement went into effect earlier this month. I think April 4th is when those inspections started. We have the AMS graders at their posts doing those inspections. It's not an SPS issue, but it just goes to the larger narrative of Secretary's expectations, whether it's the food safety meat inspectors at FSIS or the AMS graders or the folks we have in the market news space. His expectation is we're at our post doing our work, and if there's disruptions to the food supply chain, it will not be because of a lack of USDA personnel facilitating that commerce and making sure the trade is moving. The SPS issues don't stop. The high-path AI incident recently is really unfortunate event, but we're working our way through that. And there's been some other minor challenges in some of the plant virus space, and we're doing our best to keep those from compounding and complicating the flow of commerce. But I think, to Rob's point, trade and commerce are a priority for the administration, for the Secretary. That's essential, critical. And from USDA's role, we will be there to do that work and make sure we're not an impediment or a choke point in any of those processes.
Great, thank you both. Another interesting question for USDA that's not COVID related, but certainly something that's on the minds of a number of farmers and ranchers across the country. So market access is key for the agricultural industry. And one thing that folks have to deal with daily is access to quality internet. And being able to communicate within the industry. Wondering if someone from USDA can give us an update on USDA's work to improve rural broadband access.
Well, we're trying to cover a lot of topic areas here, but I don't have any top of the finger numbers in terms of how much that initiative is essentially flowing out of USDA at the moment. But the Secretary has been pretty on top of this issue as well, wanting us to make sure that we expanded where we could and where it made sense rural broadband to get into areas that didn't have it to this point. I think there was some additional stimulus money for this as well. I'm going to turn it over to Dudley real fast and see if I can pull up some of that stuff for folks on the line. But again, as Dudley pointed out, we're all hands on deck at the moment, and I can just speak from my personal sort of portfolio has narrowed pretty quickly to focus 100% on economic impacts on the various sectors due to coronavirus. But just a second, I'll see if I can find something else to help answer that question. And certainly, I imagine that you'll have outreach to folks on the line after the call is over so that we can send you any additional information if we have answers that we can't get to right now.
Yes, absolutely. And sorry to throw a curveball there. Dudley, did you have any comments on rural broadband access?
I'm really not, and I would be wasting y'all's time just to try to regurgitate some talking points. But to Dr. Johansson's point, this is obviously a priority for the Secretary and the administration. We have our mission area at USDA rural development. This has been one of their big rock priorities, at least since the Secretary's been in that role. Probably previous to that, he's had them double down on what we can do to build and support and expand that infrastructure. I think what would be most helpful for you all and for the AAC would probably be for me to take that back and see if I can get you a readout or a more up-to-date, informed status on where that stands and what the next steps are. But sorry not to be more helpful on that.
No, completely. That's very helpful. And yes, we can pass on information after the call as well. I got one more here for you, and then I'll take the two of you off the hot seat. Because the farming sector is so dependent on hiring guest workers, and there are a lot of concerns over whether or not they will have access to these workers with all the travel and visa restrictions. Can you shed some light on how the administration plans to address the concerns and whether or not the recent executive order signed by the president will impact these guest worker visas and further restrict their ability to be here to help the farm communities?
So this is Dudley. This will be another one where I won't want to muddy the waters with misinformation. One of my colleagues in the Secretary's office has been kind of our single point of focus on the ag labor, and she's been working with the Department of Labor and different embassies, especially Canada and Mexico, in trying to help manage and facilitate that flow of critical workforce, especially under all things COVID. So I will add that to the list for follow-up for you after the call.
Yeah, and just on that, also on that note, we've been working hard with State Department, DHS, and White House on this issue to limit the disruption caused to that H-2A workforce. And so we, again, as Debbie mentioned, I don't really want to muddy the waters with incorrect information, but just wanted to emphasize that we're certainly aware of the issue of labor supply. We have been working on this issue. The Secretary has been working on this issue a lot, and of course, right now it's highlighted by, whether or not this workforce is affected by other immigration policies. So, with that being said, we'll make sure that we pass that along to you as well.
Great, thank you. The next question, maybe Derek can take the question. We're going to go back to livestock for a minute. With some of the sale barns reducing the amount of feeder cattle sales, what is CME doing to monitor the integrity of the index for the April contract?
Hey, Summer, this is Tom Lasala. I'll field that one.
Tom. Thanks, Tom.
Sure. So, in addition to our normal oversight activities at CME, which includes work conducted by our market regulation team, our research department, as well as our business line, CME, the CFTC, and the USDA are in frequent communication around which auctions are operating and the volumes conducted in these auctions. At present, we believe there will be adequate volumes for settlement in April, but certainly we'll continue to monitor the situation very closely. Thank you.
Thank you. So staying on the cattle market for a moment, and so this is kind of for someone, CFTC, and we've talked about the Holcomb fire and some of the swings in volatility that we saw in the market at that point, and of course the swings in volatility we are seeing with the COVID-19. Wondering if if the chairman or Dave or someone could give us some ideas of factors that would cause these swings in volatility in the cattle market.
I'll let Dave go ahead and answer that as the head of our task force.
Well, I think, Summer, basically the reason why at first we saw a little bit of a disconnect between the cash and the futures is because, like some of the gentlemen who have spoken previously have said, they're pricing different things. So the cash market is obviously pricing a spot price, and the futures price, is pricing the end of April for say live cattle, and that time difference, and with the tremendous uncertainty that we've all had. I mean, every day it seems like when we get up and we put our computers on, there's another packing plant that's been closed, or another 2 or 3. And so I think the futures market had been pricing in some of that uncertainty, and some of that uncertainty was leading to prices in the futures market to be at a lower level than what cash was. But as we have now started to approach and get closer and closer to last trading day, cash and futures are now starting to price similar time events, and they're coming together. But I mean, in terms of the Holcomb fire, like I mentioned in the previous answer, this is the Holcomb fire times 10 or 15 or 20 because of the number of plants that are at stake and the number of states that are involved and the number of employees that are out. And so I think all of that has created that volatility, which is based on fear and uncertainty. And I think we're in times that are just incredibly uncertain. We don't know if by next month, more packing plants will be online, or will this continue, and we'll continue to have more and more of these plants have to go offline. If that's the case, I think we'll see situations where cash and futures continue to get pulled down, and we'll have the box beef prices probably be at very high levels because less and less product is moving through the system.
Thanks, David. And just to staying on cattle market here, and to go back and put USDA on the spot again, but also certainly I think David Motto could jump in here as well. Can you expand upon the current standing of the investigation that was started after the Holcomb fire, and how USDA decided to expand its review to similar circumstances that followed the outbreak of COVID-19? And also kind of wondering what the status is of the CFTC's cooperation with various requests that the Commission has received for investigations into the cattle market as well.
So this is Dudley Hoskins, USDA. I'll take the first part of that and get out of the way. So unlike the rural broadband or ag labor, this is something I have some awareness on, but unfortunately, this is really something we as a department are not prepared to comment on publicly. So in terms of timeline and process, the Secretary made some public statements following the Holcomb fire in August. There were some additional tweets and conversations he's had publicly since the COVID epidemic was designated a national crisis. Beyond those sort of public-facing pinch points, all we can tell you is the investigation is ongoing, and the Packers and Stockyards Division are working with the full authorities under their statutory permissibilities, and they're working. They're doing that work in consultation with other partners in the federal government. So it is ongoing. The investigation will go as far and wide as the evidence takes them. The Secretary's been clear he does not anticipate putting any kind of fictional or man-made timelines on how far that investigation will go or how long it will last. So I think what he articulated earlier is really where the department is on it publicly. The Packers and Stockyard folks are doing their work. They will continue to do their work. If they find evidence of violations, they will take action on those. Where and if appropriate, they will refer certain actions to our federal partners in the Department of Justice. But beyond that, we really can't speak to timeline or specificity or anything beyond that. So I'll stop there. Not trying to be evasive, but that's really where the department is. So thank you.
Thank you, Dudley. David, Amada, did you want to comment at all on kind of the status of the CFTC's role and the various kind of the cooperation and some of the requests that have come in that we've seen in the press on the cattle market?
Sure. The only thing I can add is we've cooperated with the USDA in the past on data requests, and we'll continue to provide data as needed.
Thank you. Jumping real quick to CME and the messaging efficiency program. As markets continue to adjust, what has CME seen from both pre-market period activity, and do you have any updates on the MEP activities?
Hi, Summer. It's Tom Lasala. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let me begin by stating that we're continuously monitoring our markets and have a dedicated team in market regulation specifically committed to monitoring activity in the pre-opening period. Price action in the pre-open is impacted by a number of factors, including news, market fundamentals, the number of participants that choose to enter the market, as well as the strength of those views, and additionally the time at which those participants choose to enter the market. Where we see problematic activity in the pre-open, our practice is to contact the participant promptly to help ensure the activity does not continue as we then conduct a review or a formal investigation. I know that in speaking with my colleagues on the business side that we already have a meeting scheduled with NCBA for next Wednesday, April 29th, to discuss both the pre-opening period as well as the messaging efficiency program. So, thank you.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about the pre-opening, what it's for, and what the messaging efficiency program does?
More efficient with the pre-open. Yeah, it's a period in time where parties can enter orders, and you're looking to effectively find price level. And during the time in the pre-open, which happens to be almost 2.5 hours, of which the last 30 seconds are locked down, so you can no longer cancel or modify orders in the last 30 seconds. What you're effectively looking for is an equilibrium price, and then the volume of those orders that are still existing in the market after the closeout that basically intersect, will trade at that equilibrium price as soon as the market opens. So I mean, what we've seen, especially during these volatile times, is very, very different perspectives insofar as what value is. Very different perspectives, and I mentioned earlier, not only, you talk about the different perspectives, but when participants choose to enter the market. So there's been somewhat, I'll say, behavioral differences that have come into play during this time where we're getting, significant market volatility that's, I think, made or sensitized people in the market, their view and their participation in the pre-open. So it's one that we're communicating very significantly with market users. And, as I mentioned, the meeting next week with NCBA, we plan to have significant discussions with them about that at that time.
Thank you. So going back to Chairman Tarbert for a minute, Chairman, there's been a lot of discussion about the CFTC and the USDA working together. Are you talking to other agencies during this time? Are you having regular conversations with the Hill, with other agencies? How are you working with other parts of the government during this time?
Thank you, Summer. The answer is that we are working very closely with lots of other agencies in the U.S. government, as well as our counterparts overseas. Now, many of the I'd say when it pertains to agricultural issues, it's obviously USDA, but obviously the energy sector has seen volatility as well. We've had frequent calls with the Department of Energy. And then every day, almost, I have a call with one of our other federal financial regulators. I just literally got off the phone 15 minutes before we started this Agriculture Advisory Committee meeting with the chairman of the SEC, with whom I have frequent contact, but also the Federal Reserve, the banking regulators, the Treasury Department. Again, we want to make sure as a financial regulator that the dislocations that we see due to the coronavirus in the real economy don't take what is obviously a historical and unparalleled economic crisis and turn it into a financial crisis. So right now, the financial markets are performing well in the sense that they're working the way they were intended to work in most cases, but insofar as they're reflecting what's going on in the real economy, but they themselves are not adversely affecting the real economy. They are not a source of systemic risk, which is affecting everyone else. And we want to obviously make sure we keep it that way. So when it comes to oversight of our clearing houses, our market participants, major financial institutions, we're working very closely with our other counterparts here in the United States regulatory community, but throughout the world.
Thank you. And so one last question here for the chairman. How will the CFTC continue moving forward with the rulemaking priorities due to the disruption from COVID-19?
Sure, great question, and it's one that I hit on a little bit in our last open meeting, where we had 5 votes, three proposed rulemakings and 2 final rulemakings, and it's simply this. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the world and has changed this country in the last month or so. And the CFTC has pivoted to make sure that we are absolutely responsive to any needs to ensure that our markets remain orderly and liquid. So in other words, dealing with the issue at hand is job number 1. That includes, for example, with respect to this audience, setting up the livestock task force to monitor severe volatility in parts of the ag sector. And it also involves issuing relief where needed, temporary targeted relief, to make sure that our markets remain orderly and liquid, and that the American public, in a time when they're facing perhaps the most risk they've ever faced, they're able to use our markets to hedge. So that's job number 1. That said, this agency can certainly walk and chew gum at the same time. That's why we're having this call today. And so while that's job number 1, we also are going to continue to move forward on the policy agenda, which has lasted in some cases for a number of years. So we know that many people on this call have certain things they want to see done, and we're fully committed to doing that. And so what we have done is basically pivot our resources to focus first and foremost on COVID-19 and its effects, and we'll continue to do that. And then, rather than start new big projects, new proposals, what we've done is essentially decided to anything that's basically, sort of either proposed or in good enough shape that it can be proposed in, let's say, the next 2 months. We're going to go ahead and propose that and then pivot and focus on finalizing everything that we propose. So in other words, we're going to begin what we started, but we're not going to start anything new and big. And that's a way that I think we can balance making sure that this agency is responsive to COVID-19, but at the same time, not losing sight of the bigger policy issues that many people have wanted us to resolve for a number of years.
Thank you, Chairman. And as we are approaching on the almost 2-hour mark here, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the call. Thank you all for joining today. This is a very busy time for everyone, and we appreciate your participation. And with that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.